Imagine a hotel designed not for guests, but for ghosts. A place where the doors open to brick walls, where the staircases lead to nowhere, and where the landlord doesn't want your rent. He wants your life. You think you know the story of H. Holmes. You think you know the monster, but you haven't yet heard the voices of those buried beneath the floorboards of his castle. Chicago, 1893. They called it the White City. It was a miracle of plaster and electric light, a desperate attempt to show the world that America had risen from the ashes. Millions flocked here, teachers, typists, and heiresses, all anonymous, all looking for a new beginning. In the chaos of the World's Fair, it was easy to disappear. A letter home gets lost in the mail. A telegram is never sent. People assumed you just moved on. No one was looking for the missing, except for one man with piercing blue eyes and a charm that felt like velvet, but cut like a razor. His name was Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. To his neighbors in Englewood, he was a success story. He bought a pharmacy, then the land across the street, and began building a behemoth. But Holmes was a conductor of a chaotic symphony. He hired and fired construction crews every few weeks. Why? Because if no one builds the whole house, no one knows the layout. One carpenter installs a secret vent. Another builds a soundproof vault. Only Holmes held the master key to the labyrinth. He was always so polite, a neighbor might have said. Tip of the hat a soft "good evening." But there was a coldness to him like touching marble. We joked about his building. We called it the castle. If only we knew that the architecture was designed to kill. As the fair opened, the trap was set. Young women, traveling alone for the first time in history, saw the signs. Rooms for rent. They met the dapper doctor. He took their bags. He offered them tea. One of these women was Emmeline Seagrand. She was beautiful, intelligent, and worked as Holmes's personal stenographer. She believed she was in love. "Dearest mother," she might have written in a letter that was never posted. "I've found a room in a magnificent building. The landlord is a doctor, quite peculiar, but he says he has big plans for me. My room has no window, which is odd, but he says it keeps the street noise out. I finally feel like my life is beginning." Emmeline didn't know the vent above her bed was connected to a gas line in Holmes's office. She didn't know that when she stepped into his large walk-in safe to retrieve some papers, the door would click shut and the air would slowly vanish. Police later found a footprint on the inside of that vault door, a permanent mark made by a woman in a state of primal panic trying to kick her way out of a steel tomb. The murder castle was a 3-story machine of death. On the second floor, the hallways turned at 90-degree angles and ended in solid walls. Some rooms were lined with asbestos to stifle screams. Others were ironclad to become ovens. Holmes sat in his office like a spider at the center of a web, listening through hidden tubes, watching through secret peepholes. He wasn't just a killer. He was a voyeur of terror. Then there was Julia Connor. She came to Chicago with her husband and daughter Pearl, looking for the American dream. Holmes didn't just kill her, he dismantled her family. He seduced Julia, drove her husband away, and when she became inconvenient, likely due to a pregnancy, she and little Pearl simply vanished. On Christmas Eve, 1891, Julia was seen entering the castle. She was never seen alive again. Weeks later, Holmes was seen casually carrying a large trunk out of the building. He later sold a high-quality female skeleton to a local medical school. He didn't just take lives, He profited from the remains, turning the human body into a commodity. As the World's Fair reached its crescendo, the disappearances accelerated. The Pitezel children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, became the most tragic footnotes in this dark history. Holmes was a master of the long con. He convinced their father, Ben Pitezel, to fake his own death for insurance money. Instead, Holmes killed Ben for real, then took the children on a gruesome cross-country journey, telling them their father was waiting for them in the next city. I remember the way he looked at us. A fictionalized memory of Alice Pitezel might suggest. He said Papa was just around the corner, but every house we stayed in felt colder than the last. He made us climb into a large trunk to play a game. It smelled like old rain and medicine. He told us to stay very still. I held Nellie's hand. We are still waiting for the light to come back. The reality of Howard Pitezel was even worse. In a small house in Indianapolis, Holmes rented a property, bought a large stove, and then Howard was gone. Years later, investigators found a set of teeth and a few charred bones in the chimney. How did he get away with it for so long? Chicago in the 1890s was a city of smoke and mirrors. The police were overwhelmed by the influx of millions of tourists. Holmes used aliases, dozens of them. He was a master of the legal system, tying up creditors in court while he moved on to his next victim. He was a pioneer of the urban stranger phenomenon. In a small village, everyone knows when a girl goes missing. In Chicago, she's just another name in a sea of faces. The end began not in Chicago, but in Philadelphia, after a failed insurance scam. A detective named Frank Gaia began a dogged pursuit that would lead him across the Midwest and into the bowels of the castle. When the police finally raided the building at 63rd and Wallace, they found a house of horrors. In the basement, vats of acid, a dissecting table, and a furnace large enough to hold a human body. They found piles of women's clothing, jewelry that had been stripped from victims, and bones. So many bones that they couldn't count the individual lives lost. Holmes sat in his cell and wrote a confession. He claimed to have killed 27 people, then changed it to 100, then said he was being transformed into the devil. "I was born with the devil in me," he famously wrote. "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." But was it the devil, or was it a man who simply realized that in a modern industrial society, people are easily replaced and even more easily forgotten? The castle itself met a poetic end. Shortly before it could be opened as a macabre museum for tourists, it was gutted by a mysterious fire. Some say the neighbors did it to erase the stain on their community. Others say Holmes's associates burned it to hide more bodies. Today, a post office stands on the site. People walk over that ground every day to mail letters, unaware that beneath the concrete, the echoes of the white city's darkest shadow still linger. We must remember the names: Emmeline, Julia, Pearl, Alice, Nellie, Howard. They weren't just victims of H.H. Holmes. They were people with favorite songs, with families who waited for letters that never came, with dreams of a life in the great city of Chicago. Holmes wanted to turn them into skeletons and statistics. Our job is to give them back their humanity. As we look back at the 19th century, we see Holmes as a monster of his time. But the conditions that created him, anonymity, the pursuit of profit over people, and the silence of a busy world, are still with us The murder palace is gone, but the shadows it cast are long. Imagine a hotel designed not for guests, but for ghosts. A place where the doors open to brick walls, where the staircases lead to nowhere, and where the landlord doesn't want your rent. He wants your life. You think you know the story of H. Holmes. You think you know the monster, but you haven't yet heard the voices of those buried beneath the floorboards of his castle. This is not just a story about death. It is a story about the silence that allowed it to happen. Chicago, 1893. The world was watching. They called it the White City. It was a miracle of plaster and electric light, a desperate, beautiful attempt to show the globe that America had risen from the ashes of the Civil War. It was the center of the universe. If you were alive in 1893, this was where you wanted to be. Millions flocked here. Teachers, typists, heiresses, and drifters. They came with suitcases full of dreams and pockets full of cash. They were anonymous. They were free. And that was the problem. In the chaos of the World's Fair, it was easy to disappear. A letter home gets lost in the mail. A telegram is never sent. People assumed you just moved on, found a new job, a new love. No one was looking for the missing, except for one man. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett, but the world would come to know him as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. To the people of the Englewood district, he wasn't a threat. He was a catch. He was charming, dapper, a medical doctor with a soothing voice and piercing blue eyes that seemed to lock onto you and never let go. He arrived in Chicago sensing an opportunity, not just for money, though he loved the scam, but for something darker. He bought a pharmacy. He bought the land across the street, and he started to build. He was the architect of a chaotic symphony. He had a strategy that was pure genius and pure paranoia. He hired crews for 2 weeks, let them build a specific hallway or a chute, and then fired them without pay, claiming their work was shoddy. Why fire the crews? Simple. If no one builds the whole house, no one knows the layout. One carpenter knows about the trapdoor in the bathroom. Another knows about the greased chute to the basement. But only Holmes holds the master key. Only Holmes knows how the pieces fit together. By 1893, the building was a behemoth. The ground floor was respectable. A drugstore, a jewelry counter, a barber shop. But the upper floors were a labyrinth. The World's Fair opened in May. The hotels downtown were fully booked or charging extortionate rates. And here was the castle, just a short train ride away, offering luxury rooms at bargain prices. Young women, traveling alone for the first time in history, arrived at the Englewood station. They saw the advertisement. They met the charming Dr. Holmes. He took their bags. He offered them tea. He told them they were safe here. They didn't know that the door to their room could only be locked from the outside. They didn't know that the vent above the bed wasn't for fresh air, it was for gas. Among the first to fall into the trap was Julia Connor. She wasn't a tourist, she was a neighbor. She was a beautiful woman who worked at the pharmacy's jewelry counter, and she had come to Chicago with her husband and her little daughter, Pearl. Holmes didn't just kill her. He dismantled her life. He seduced her, convinced her to divorce her husband, and isolated her from everyone she knew. Julia believed she was starting a new life with a wealthy doctor. But as soon as she became inconvenient, likely due to a pregnancy, the clock stopped ticking. On Christmas Eve, 1891, Julia was seen entering the castle. She was never seen alive again. Weeks later, Holmes was seen by his neighbors casually carrying a large trunk out of the building. He later sold a high-quality female skeleton to a local medical school. He didn't just take lives, he profited from the remains. And little Pearl, the child who played in the hallways, she vanished into the shadows with her mother, just another loose end tied off by a monster. Then there was Emmeline Cigrand. She was the glowing image of the modern woman, intelligent, independent, a stenographer who came to work for Holmes. She wrote letters home to Indiana, gushing about the handsome doctor and the wonderful opportunities in Chicago. She was in love, or she thought she was. One day, Holmes asked her to step into his office vault to retrieve some papers. This wasn't a normal safe. It was an airtight room lined with steel. As she stepped inside, the heavy door swung shut. The lock clicked. Emmeline likely thought it was a mistake. She probably knocked, then pounded, then screamed. Holmes didn't open the door. He sat at his desk, just a few feet away, listening. When police later investigated the vault, they found a footprint on the inside of the door. A perfect, terrifying imprint of a shoe, marking the spot where Emmeline had tried to kick her way out as the oxygen slowly faded away. The castle was a machine. On the second floor, hallways turned at sharp angles and ended in blank walls to confuse fleeing victims. There were greased chutes large enough to slide a body directly from the upper floors to the basement, and the basement was a factory of death. It housed vats of acid, a stretching rack, and a kiln large enough to incinerate a human being. Holmes wasn't just killing, he was erasing people. He was stripping them of their flesh, their names, and their history, turning them into ash and bone. But the most heartbreaking chapter of this story involves the Pitezel family. Ben Pitezel was Holmes's partner in crime, a carpenter who helped build the castle. Holmes convinced Ben to fake his own death to scam an insurance company out of $10,000. The plan was simple. Ben would go into hiding, they'd use a cadaver to fool the coroner, and they'd split the money. But Holmes had no intention of splitting anything. He killed Ben Pitezel for real, and then he went for the children. Holmes took 3 of the Pitezel children, Alice, Nellie, and little Howard, on a cross-country trip. He told them their father was alive, hiding in another city, waiting for them. He became their guardian. He bought them candy. He held their hands. All the while, he was moving them from city to city, keeping them just one step ahead of their frantic mother, who was also traveling with Holmes, unaware that her husband was dead and her children were being held captive just a few miles away. Imagine the confusion of Alice Pitezel. She was 15 years old. She wrote letters to her mother that Holmes promised to mail, but he never did. In them, she wrote about how cold it was, how much she missed home, and how Mr. Howard was taking them to see Papa. In Toronto, Holmes rented a house with a cellar. He made Alice and Nellie climb into a large trunk. He might have told them it was a game or a hiding place. He drilled a hole in the side of the trunk and connected a gas hose. He buried them in the cellar floor. Little Howard Pitezel, only 8 years old, was the last to go. In a rented cottage in Irvington outside Indianapolis, Holmes bought a large stove. The local hardware store owner remembered the man with the blue eyes asking if the stove was big enough to burn meat. Howard was never seen again. Years later, a detective would find a few charred bones and a set of teeth in that chimney. How did he get away with it for so long? Chicago was a city of smoke and mirrors. The police were overwhelmed. Holmes used dozens of aliases. He was a master manipulator of the legal system, tying up creditors in court while he moved on to his next victim. He was a pioneer of the urban stranger phenomenon. In a small village, everyone knows when a girl goes missing. In Chicago, she's just another name in a sea of faces. But the silence couldn't last forever. The end began not in Chicago, but in Philadelphia. The insurance company became suspicious about the Pitezel payout. They hired the Pinkertons, and eventually, a dogged detective named Frank Geyer began to pull the thread. Geyer wasn't looking for a serial killer, he was looking for a fraudster. But as he retraced Holmes's steps across the Midwest, he found something far worse. He found the houses Holmes had rented. He found the stove. He found the cellar in Toronto. He physically dug up the truth, shovel by shovel. When the police finally raided the castle in Chicago, the press descended like vultures. The murder castle became the sensation of the century. Crowds gathered to stare at the ominous building. They found the acid vats. They found the jewelry of the missing women. They found a dissection table stained with blood. Holmes sat in his prison cell, cool and collected. He wrote a memoir. He sold his story. He reveled in the attention. At first, he denied everything. Then he confessed to killing 27 people. Then he claimed he killed nearly 100. He told the press, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." He claimed his appearance was changing, that his face was elongating, taking on the likeness of the devil himself. It was his final con, trying to convince the world he was a supernatural force rather than just a greedy, cruel man. On May 7th, 1896, H. Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. He didn't die instantly. His neck didn't snap. He strangled slowly for nearly 20 minutes, twitching at the end of the rope. Before his death, he had one final request. He asked to be buried in a coffin filled with cement, buried 10 feet deep and covered with another layer of cement. He was terrified that doctors would dig up his body and dissect him, doing to him exactly what he had done to so many others. The castle itself met a poetic end. Shortly before it could be opened as a macabre museum for tourists, it was gutted by a mysterious fire. Some say the neighbors did it to erase the stain on their community. Others say Holmes's associates burned it to hide more evidence. Today, a post office stands on the site in Englewood. People walk over that ground every day to mail letters and pay bills, largely unaware that beneath the concrete, the echoes of the White City's darkest shadow still linger. We must remember the names: Julia, Pearl, Emmeline, Minnie, Nanny, Alice, Nellie, Howard. They were not just props in a horror story, they were people. They had favorite songs. They had families who waited on porches for them to come home. They had dreams of a life in the great city. Holmes wanted to reduce them to objects, to profit, to silence. But by telling their stories, by looking past the myth of the evil genius and seeing the human tragedy he caused, we take away his power. The murder palace is gone. The White City has long since rusted away, but the lesson remains. We live in a world that is faster and more anonymous than 1893, a world where it is still too easy to look away. Holmes was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who thrived in the dark spots of a society too busy to notice who was missing. And that is the most terrifying truth of all. To fully grasp the magnitude of the tragedy, we must pull back the curtain on one of the most calculated chapters of Holmes's career. a chapter that played out right in the shadow of the Ferris wheel, the story of the Williams sisters. While Emmeline Cigrand was the romance and the Pitezels were the pawns, Minnie and Nanny Williams were the jackpot. Minnie was an heiress to a vast fortune of Texas real estate, a sweet, somewhat naive woman who had known Holmes years before in Boston. When they reconnected in Chicago, Holmes didn't see a friend. He saw a land deed. He courted Minnie with a suffocating intensity. He didn't just want to marry her. He wanted to consume her identity. He invited her to the castle, which he described as a bustling hub of commerce. He charmed her into transferring the deed of her Texas property to a man named Alexander Bond, an alias for Holmes, of course. But Minnie wasn't alone. She had a sister, Nanny, who was skeptical, protective, and sharp. Holmes knew that a skeptical sister was a dangerous liability. So he invited Nanny to Chicago for the World's Fair. Imagine Nanny's arrival. It was July 1893, the height of the summer heat. The city was a furnace. Holmes played the role of the gracious host, taking the sisters to the fair, buying them tickets to the best attractions, dining them under the electric lights of the court of honor. He wrote to their aunt, playing the part of the devoted fiancé. But inside the castle, the trap was already oiled. Nanny wrote a letter to her aunt saying, "Brother Harry says we are to go to Europe soon. I am so happy." That letter was the last time her voice was ever heard. The disappearance of the Williams sisters highlights the terrifying efficiency of the castle's design. One evening, Holmes suggested to Nanny that she go to the roof to enjoy the cool breeze. To get there, she had to pass through a specific room on the third floor. We can only reconstruct what happened next based on the forensic evidence found later. A struggle, a scream cut short, and then the silence of the vault. Minnie was next. Holmes couldn't have her asking questions. With both sisters gone, Holmes was now the owner of prime Texas real estate. But he didn't stop there. He even wore their jewelry, gifting his own wife, one of his many wives who knew nothing of his crimes, Minnie's watch. It was a trophy, displayed openly on a wrist that had never known hard labor. This brings us to the darker reality of the castle's discovery, a sequence of events often glossed over in the history books. When the police finally entered the building in 1895, led by the grim-faced Detective Geyer and Chicago authorities, they weren't walking into a crime scene, they were walking into a puzzle box. The electricity had been cut. They had to navigate the labyrinth by the light of lanterns. Imagine the shadows dancing on those walls. The police found doors that opened onto solid brick. They found staircases that ascended into the ceiling. But it was the basement that broke the hardened detectives. The air in the cellar was thick with a scent that no amount of time could air out. The smell of decay mixed with harsh chemicals. In the ash of the large stove, they found a gold chain. In a pile of refuse, they found a charred piece of a dress fabric that matched a description given by a grieving mother. They found a dissecting table that was undeniably professional, stained with fluids that had soaked deep into the wood. But the most chilling discovery was a pile of quicklime. Holmes had underestimated how much quicklime it took to decompose a body. He had left half-finished work. The sheer volume of human remains, ribs, vertebrae, finger bones, was so fragmented that the coroner couldn't determine if they were looking at 3 bodies or 20. The floor of the basement was literally paved with the evidence of his atrocities. The media circus that followed the discovery was the first of its kind in American history. H. Holmes became the first celebrity monster. The newspapers dubbed him the Arch-Fiend. They published diagrams of the castle that were exaggerated, adding torture devices that likely didn't exist, but the truth was horrific enough. Holmes fed on this. In prison, he was calm, almost bored. He read the articles about himself and corrected the reporter's grammar in the margins. He was a narcissist of the highest order, believing himself to be a superior being, a product of evolution designed to prey on the weak. But the story of H. Holmes has a final strange twist that haunts the legacy of the case, the so-called Holmes curse. Legend has it that Holmes, standing on the gallows, put a hex on everyone who had condemned him. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the string of deaths that followed his execution is unsettling. The coroner who examined Holmes's body died of a sudden blood infection. The judge who sentenced him collapsed and died shortly after the trial. The priest who delivered his last rites was found dead of heart failure. Even the jury foreman met a gruesome end in an electrical accident. It was as if the dark energy of the castle refused to dissipate, clinging to anyone who dared to look too closely into the abyss. And what of the castle itself? Its destruction was as dramatic as its construction. In August 1895, while Holmes was still in prison awaiting trial, 3 explosions rocked the Englewood neighborhood. Flames shot into the night sky. The castle was burning. Firefighters arrived, but the labyrinthine layout that had trapped so many victims now trapped the smoke and heat, turning the building into a chimney. The roof collapsed. The turrets fell. By morning, the murder palace was a smoking ruin. The police suspected arson, perhaps accomplices destroying evidence, or perhaps vigilantes purging the neighborhood of evil. But the shell remained, standing like a rotten tooth, until it was finally razed to the ground years later. Today, if you visit the site at 63rd and Wallace in Englewood, you will find a modest, functional post office. It is a place of mundane routine. People stand in line. They buy stamps. They check their phones. There is no plaque. There is no memorial. The city of Chicago, in its relentless drive forward, paved over the horror. But sometimes, on cold November nights, when the wind comes off Lake Michigan and rattles the street lamps, the locals say you can still feel a heaviness in the air on that block, a static charge, a sense of being watched. The story of H. Holmes is not just a story about a killer, it is a mirror held up to the Gilded Age. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the cost of progress. The World's Fair was a facade, a beautiful lie built to hide the grime and poverty of the city. Holmes was the truth behind that lie. He was the embodiment of the ruthlessness required to make it in America, stripped of all morality. He looked at people and saw only assets, insurance policies, skeletons, real estate. He was the ultimate capitalist of death. But to truly understand the depth of the darkness, we have to look back before the castle rose from the dirt of Englewood. We have to look at the making of the monster. Holmes didn't just wake up one day and decide to build a slaughterhouse. His education in death began years earlier in the cold, sterile anatomy labs of the University of Michigan. It was the early 1880s. Medical science was advancing, but it was still a gruesome business. Dissection was the rite of passage for every young doctor, but for Herman Mudgett, the man who would become Holmes, it was something else. It was a revelation. While other students gagged at the smell of formaldehyde and the sight of flayed muscle, Holmes was fascinated, not by the miracle of life, but by the mechanics of the vessel. It was here, surrounded by the silence of the dead, that he realized a human body had value long after the breath had left it. A body could be an insurance claim. A body could be a skeleton sold to a laboratory. A body was just biological currency waiting to be cashed. He began his criminal career not with murder, but with the dead who were already resting. He concocted schemes to defraud insurance companies using cadavers stolen from the school's laboratory. He would disfigure the faces to make them unidentifiable, claim they were victims of accidents, and collect the payouts. It was practice. He was learning how to manipulate the system, how to act the part of the grieving relative, and most importantly, how to look at a dead human being and feel absolutely nothing. This dissociation was his superpower. It was the tool that allowed him, years later, to sit down to a hearty dinner while the kiln in his basement was turning a woman into ash just beneath his feet. This double life followed him to Chicago, while he was courting Minnie Williams and Emmeline Segrand. Holmes was also a husband to 3 different women at the same time. He was a trigamist, juggling families with the same precision he used to juggle his debts. There was Clara, his first wife back in New Hampshire, whom he abandoned but never divorced. There was Myrta Belknap, a Chicago girl he married for her family's connections, setting her up in a house in the suburbs while he lived at the castle. And then there was Georgiana Yoke, the woman he married just before his final run from the law. Imagine the psychological tightrope he walked every day. He would spend his days in the castle, overseeing the horrors of the second floor, perhaps negotiating the sale of a skeleton he had articulated himself, a skill he bragged about. Then he would take the train to Wilmette to have dinner with Myrta and their daughter, playing the role of the tired businessman. He brought toys for his child. He complained about the economy. He kissed his wife goodnight, and Myrta never knew. She never knew that the jewelry he gave her had been pulled from the cold neck of a missing heiress. She never knew that the business partners he mentioned were people he had already dissolved in acid. The compartmentalization was absolute. To Holmes, the women in his life were either audiences for his charm or assets for his bank account. There was no middle ground. There were close calls, moments when the mask almost slipped. The castle wasn't empty. It had tenants, everyday people who rented the storefronts or the apartments on the safer side of the building. They lived on the edge of the abyss and didn't know it, but some noticed things. A pharmacist who worked for Holmes later reported that the doctor was obsessed with the gas supply. He would catch Holmes standing in the hallway staring at the gas fixtures with a strange intensity. Others complained about the smells, strange, acrid chemical odors that would waft up through the vents. Holmes always had an excuse. "It's the laboratory," he would say with a reassuring smile. "We're testing a new bleaching agent for the laundry business." Or, "The rendering plant down the road is active tonight." His voice was so calm, his demeanor so professional, that people swallowed their doubts. They wanted to believe him. It was easier to believe in a bad smell than in a monster. One of the most chilling untold aspects of the Holmes saga involves the Skeleton War. In the late 19th century, medical schools were desperate for teaching tools. Supply couldn't keep up with demand. Holmes, ever the entrepreneur, stepped into this gap. He didn't just dispose of his victims. he recycled them. He had a fully equipped articulation rack in the basement. After the flesh was stripped, often using quicklime or flesh-eating beetles, he would reassemble the bones with wire and springs. He sold these skeletons to medical schools and laboratories across the Midwest for anywhere from $25 to $50, a significant sum in 1893. Think about the horror of that transaction. A student at a medical college in Illinois might have spent a semester studying the anatomy of a hand, never knowing that the hand belonged to Julia Connor, a woman who had once served customers at a jewelry counter just a few miles away. The ultimate violation wasn't just the murder. It was the commodification. He sold them piece by piece. And let's not forget the sheer audacity of his Fort Worth project. Just before his capture, Holmes had moved to Texas. He had inherited the Williams sisters' property and planned to build a second castle. He started construction on a new building in downtown Fort Worth. It was to be even grander, with more retail space and presumably more hidden chambers. He told locals he was building a hotel. He told investors he was building a trade center. But the blueprints bore a striking resemblance to the Inglewood Horror House. Had he not been arrested for the horse swindle in St. Louis, a petty crime that unraveled his entire web, he would have likely replicated his slaughterhouse in the South. The murder castle was not intended to be a one-time event. It was a franchise model. The investigation that finally brought him down was a procedural masterpiece. But it was also a journey into madness for Detective Frank Geyer. Geyer was a family man who had recently lost his own wife and child to a fire. Now, he was tasked with finding the Pitezel children. As he traveled from Cincinnati to Indianapolis to Toronto, digging up basements and interviewing neighbors, he was haunted by the ghosts of his own past. Every time he found a piece of evidence, a toy, a shoe, a charred bone, it chipped away at his soul. The public followed Geyer's progress through the newspapers like a serialized dark novel. When he finally found the bodies of Alice and Nellie in that Toronto cellar, the nation wept. But for Geyer, it was a confirmation of a pure, chaotic evil that defied logic. In the courtroom, Holmes turned the trial into his own personal theater. He fired his lawyers. He rehired them. He cross-examined witnesses himself, displaying a shocking knowledge of the law. He seemed to enjoy the banter. At one point, he looked at a witness who was testifying about the layout of the castle and smirked, as if they were sharing an inside joke. He showed no remorse, no fear, only a supreme arrogance. He believed he could talk his way out of the noose. He believed he was smarter than the judge, the jury, and the hangman. Even as he stood on the gallows, he was checking the trapdoor, analyzing the mechanism, the engineer in him working until the very last second. The legacy of H. Holmes is often romanticized in books and movies as a mastermind story, a Sherlock Holmes villain come to life. But if you strip away the myth, you find something far more pathetic and terrifying. A grifter, a small, greedy man who found that killing people was easier than paying them. He was the dark side of the American entrepreneurial spirit, the idea that if you can get away with it, it's not a crime, it's just business. And what of the white city that surrounded him? The World's Fair burned down too in a massive fire in 1894. The great plaster monuments to civilization turned to dust, just like the victims in Holmes's basement. Chicago rebuilt itself, growing upward into the sky with steel and glass. But the foundation of the modern city is built on stories like this. Stories of people who came looking for paradise and found a predator. If you walk down 63rd Street today, the wind still howls through the gap where the castle stood. The post office employees go about their work. The buses hiss to a stop. Life goes on. But history has a way of vibrating in the ground. The voices of the lost, the stenographers, the heiresses, the children are still there, waiting for someone to stop and listen. They remind us that the line between a charming smile and a bared tooth is razor thin. They remind us that monsters don't look like monsters. They look like us. They look like the doctor next door. And they are always watching for the next unlocked door. To separate the man from the myth, we have to navigate a labyrinth even more confusing than the castle itself. The American media of the 1890s. When the story broke, it wasn't just news, it was the birth of modern tabloid journalism. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were in a circulation war, and H. Holmes was the ultimate weapon. Their reporters paid building superintendents for gossip. They bribed police officers for sketches. They published diagrams of the castle that featured elaborate elasticity gauges and medieval torture racks that likely never existed. They turned a sordid, greedy killer into a supervillain. But here is the chilling truth that the sensationalist papers missed. Holmes didn't need a torture dungeon to be terrifying. The reality was far more mundane and far more disturbing. He didn't kill for the theatrical pleasure of it. He killed for efficiency. The torture racks were a distraction. The real horror was the gas bill. The real horror was the quiet click of a lock. The exaggeration of the murder castle has actually done a disservice to history because it allows us to dismiss him as a cartoon character, a phantom of the opera. But when you strip away the Victorian melodrama, what you are left with is a man who treated human beings like disposable inventory. He was the first CEO of death. Consider the psychological torture of Carrie Pitezel, the mother of the murdered children. Her story is often overshadowed by the gruesome details of the bodies, but her journey is perhaps the cruelest con Holmes ever pulled. After killing her husband, Ben, Holmes didn't just flee. He took Carrie on a road trip. He traveled with her on the same trains, stayed in the same hotels, all while he was systematically murdering her children in different cities just a few days ahead or behind them on the route. He controlled her mail. He faked letters from the children, reading them aloud to her with a smile, telling her, "Alice says she loves the new doll I bought her." He watched a mother's hope rise, knowing fully well he had buried that hope in a cellar in Toronto. This wasn't just greed. This was a man who derived a godlike satisfaction from total control. He held her sanity in the palm of his hand and squeezed it slowly, day by day. When the truth finally came out, when Carrie stood in the morgue, identifying the decomposing remains of her little girl by the teeth and the hair ribbon she had tied herself, the sheer weight of that betrayal broke something in the American psyche. It was a loss of innocence. Before 1893, the stranger was someone to be welcomed with caution but hospitality. After Holmes, the stranger was a threat. He changed the way we look at our neighbors. He introduced the concept of the urban predator, the idea that in a city of millions, you are surrounded by potential danger, hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. Holmes was also a mirror for the scientific arrogance of the age. He used his medical degree as a shield. In the late 19th century, doctors were the new priests, revered and trusted implicitly. Holmes exploited this trust to the hilt. He used chloroform, he used surgical tools, he used the language of anatomy to dehumanize his victims. He was the dark side of the Victorian obsession with progress. While the World's Fair was celebrating the future of electricity and engineering, Holmes was using those same tools to engineer the perfect murder. He was the Industrial Revolution applied to homicide. Even his confession, the one where he claimed to be the devil, was a final act of manipulation. He knew that if he pleaded insanity or claimed demonic possession, he might avoid the hangman, or at least immortalize his name. He wrote, "I have the devil in me," not because he believed it, but because he knew it was good copy. He was branding himself right up to the moment the rope tightened. And it worked. Over a century later, we are still talking about him. We are still fascinated by the man with the blue eyes. But we must resist the urge to give him the legacy he wanted. He wanted to be the arch-fiend. He wanted to be a legend. Instead, we should see him for what he was, a small, broken man with a hole inside him where a soul should be, a man who was so terrified of being ordinary that he became a monster. The murder castle is gone, replaced by the pavement and grass of a quiet Chicago neighborhood. The physical evidence has turned to dust, but the lesson of H. Holmes remains etched in the foundation of the modern world. It is a reminder that evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it builds a hotel. Sometimes it offers you a job. And sometimes it looks you in the eye, smiles, and opens the door. But the fire that finally gutted the castle in August of 1895 didn't just burn wood, plaster, and secret chutes. It seemed to incinerate the very answers the world was begging for. When the flames roared through the Englewood night, destroying the upper floors and collapsing the elaborate turrets into the basement, it felt like a final, defiant act of erasure. Witnesses on the street that night reported that the fire didn't start in one place. It erupted from two distinct points simultaneously, a hallmark of professional arson. The question hung in the smoke-filled air. Was this the work of an accomplice? Perhaps the mysterious caretaker Holmes had once employed, trying to destroy the remaining evidence of the horrors inside? Or was it the neighbors, the good people of Chicago, finally deciding that they could no longer sleep with such an architectural abomination casting a shadow over their homes? As the walls fell and the sparks drifted over the sleeping city, the secrets of the layout, the exact mechanics of the asphyxiation vaults, the precise angles of the hidden peepholes, the intricate wiring of the alarm bells were lost to history. We are left only with blueprints drawn from the shaky memories of fired carpenters and the nightmares of those few who managed to escape. And we must remember, there were those who escaped. In our fascination with the body count, we often overlook the near misses, the people who walked up those stairs, felt the hair stand up on the back of their necks, and turned around just in time. Consider the story of Ms. Kate Durkee, a woman who rented a room in the castle during the height of the World's Fair. She later told police about her time in the belly of the beast. She described Holmes's peculiar, almost hypnotic habit of asking her to sign insurance documents with the dates left blank. She described the way he would stand perfectly still in the hallway at 2 a.m., listening to the house settle, his head cocked like a bird of prey. She described the air in the hallways, stagnant, smelling faintly of gas and something sweet like old flowers. One night, overcome by a primal sense of dread she couldn't articulate, she packed her bags and fled without even collecting her deposit. At the time, she chided herself for being paranoid. She told herself she was being foolish. Only later, when she saw his face plastered on the front page of every newspaper in America, did she realize that her intuition had been the only thing standing between her and the kiln. It forces us to wonder how many others brushed against the devil and walked away, unaware of how close they came to the silence. How many tourists complained about the odd smell and simply checked out, never knowing that the source of the odor was burning beneath their feet? Then there is the matter of the confession, a document that stands as perhaps the greatest con Holmes ever pulled, even facing his own mortality. In the weeks before his execution, sitting in his cell at Moya Mensing Prison, he sold his story to the Hearst newspapers for $7,500, a fortune at the time, equivalent to over $250,000 today. He confessed to 27 murders. The public devoured it. But when police and journalists began to analyze the list, they realized something bizarre. Some of the people Holmes claimed to have killed were still alive. They were walking around reading the newspaper, shocked to see their names listed as victims of the arch-fiend. Why lie? Why claim more victims than you actually had? Because for Holmes, the truth was irrelevant. He was bored. He was toying with the police, with the press, with history itself. He wanted to be the most prolific killer of the age, a celebrity of death, and if reality wouldn't provide the numbers, he would invent them. It was the final manipulation of a pathological liar who viewed the entire world as his audience. He didn't want to be remembered as a grifter who killed for money. He wanted to be remembered as a supernatural predator. However, the most unsettling chapter of the Holmes saga isn't about the man himself. It's about what happened after he dropped through the trapdoor. The legend of the Holmes curse became a sensation that gripped the public imagination for decades. It started almost immediately. The coroner, Dr. William Mattern, who had performed the autopsy on Holmes and held the killer's heart in his hands, died of a sudden, inexplicable blood poisoning shortly after the execution. Then came the judge who presided over the trial, a man of robust health, who fell ill and died suddenly. The priest who prayed with Holmes in his final moments was found dead of heart failure not long after leaving the cell. Even the foreman of the jury met a violent, freakish end in an electrical accident. A fire broke out in the office of the district attorney who prosecuted the case, destroying only the files related to Holmes, leaving everything else untouched. Was it a curse? Almost certainly not. It was likely a series of coincidences amplified by the hysteria of 1896. But the fact that the public believed it tells us something profound about the psychological impact of H. Holmes. It felt like the reach of the monster extended beyond the grave. It fueled the myth that Holmes wasn't just a man but a force of nature, a demon. It was a coping mechanism. It is easier for the human mind to believe in curses, devils, and supernatural evils than to accept the terrifying truth that a polite, well-educated, handsome white doctor could butcher women and children simply because he wanted their money. The curse allowed people to distance themselves from the reality of his banality. It made him other rather than a reflection of the society that created him. We must also look at the forensic tragedy of the castle's excavation, a detail often glossed over in the retelling. By modern standards, the investigation at 63rd and Wallace was a disaster. The police overwhelmed by the stench, the heat, and the sheer horror of what they were seeing, used shovels to clear the basement. They treated it like a construction site, not an archaeological dig. They mixed bones together. They trampled potential evidence. The bone salad they found, a horrific mix of human and animal remains, was impossible to sort with the technology of the 19th century. Ribs of a child were found mixed with the ribs of an animal. Small finger bones were indistinguishable from chicken bones in the ash. It was a chaotic scene that denied the families any closure. No one could say for sure, "This is my daughter." They could only say, "She is somewhere in that pile." This lack of identification is the final cruelty Holmes inflicted. The victims were denied even their own graves. They were merged into a collective tragedy, a mass of anonymity that Holmes had engineered. He didn't just steal their lives, he stole their deaths. And what of the execution itself? It was the final performance. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes walked to the gallows at Moyamensing Prison. He was calm. He was dressed in a suit. He chewed on a piece of gum. He showed no fear, no remorse, no trembling. He gave a speech in which he denied killing the Pitezel children, a lie he maintained to the bitter end, and then stood on the trapdoor. But the hanging was botched. The executioner didn't account for Holmes's weight correctly. When the trapdoor opened, his neck didn't snap. He didn't die instantly. Instead, H. Holmes strangled to death for nearly 20 minutes. He twitched, he kicked, and he fought for air at the end of the rope, while the witnesses watched in horrified silence. It was a slow, agonizing end, a mirror of the slow, agonizing deaths he had inflicted on so many others in his soundproof vaults. But the most revealing detail of his death was his final request. Holmes, the man who had stripped the flesh from dozens of bodies, who had sold skeletons to medical schools, who had treated the human form as nothing more than raw material, was terrified of what would happen to his body. He was petrified that doctors would dig him up and dissect him. He was afraid they would do to him exactly what he had done to Julia Connor and Minnie Williams. So he left specific instructions. He asked to be buried in a coffin filled with cement, buried 10 feet deep, and then covered with another layer of heavy cement to create an impenetrable block. He wanted to ensure that no one could ever touch him, even in death. He demanded control. He demanded a sanctity for his own body that he had denied everyone else. If you look at the timeline, the story of H. Holmes is the dark mirror of the American century. He rose with the skyscrapers. He used the new railroads to move his victims across state lines. He used the new telegraphs to deceive their families with fake messages. He used the anonymity of the exploding metropolis to hunt. He was, in a terrible way, the first modern man. He understood before anyone else that in a world of millions, a single life can be erased without a ripple. He realized that in the chaos of industrial capitalism, people were becoming commodities. Today, the site of the castle is just a patch of grass and concrete near the Englewood post office. There is no historical marker. There is no statue. The city of Chicago has tried to forget. But the story refuses to die. It resurfaces in books, in documentaries, in the whispers of tour guides who bring people to the empty lot. Why? Because H. Holmes represents the ultimate betrayal of the social contract. We trust our doctors. We trust our landlords. We trust the charming man who offers to carry our heavy luggage at the train station. Holmes took that trust and weaponized it. He proved that the white city of civilization is built on a fragile foundation, and that just beneath the surface there are cellars where the light doesn't reach. The murder palace is gone, but history is full of shadows waiting to be uncovered. If you appreciated this deep dive investigation, do us a huge favor and hit that like button. It helps these stories get found. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We are already digging into our next case, and trust me, you won't want to miss what we've found. Let me know in the comments. Do you believe the Holmes curse was real or just a media myth? I'll be reading your theories. Until next time, check your locks, trust your gut, and I'll see you in the next story.